Have you ever noticed that the loudest ending in a relationship isn't an argument, it's silence? Most people assume that if someone stops talking, they're waiting for the right moment to speak again. But that's not always how human behavior works. Sometimes silence isn't confusion, punishment, or manipulation. Sometimes it's the final stage of a decision that was made long before anyone else realized it. Today, we're exploring one of the most misunderstood patterns in relationships, what it truly means when an empath goes quiet. People often believe empaths are endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving, and always willing to explain themselves one more time. Because of that reputation, many assume they'll always come back after conflict. But psychology tells us something different. The people who invest the most emotionally are often the ones who quietly reach their limit after countless invisible disappointments. By the time their words disappear, they've usually spent weeks, months, or even years trying to make things work in ways no one else noticed. In this talk, we'll examine the subtle behavioral shifts that happen before an empath becomes silent, why that silence is frequently misunderstood, and what it reveals about emotional investment rather than emotional weakness. This isn't about labeling people or assigning blame. It's about understanding the hidden psychology behind emotional withdrawal, recognizing patterns that many overlook, and learning why the absence of conflict can sometimes communicate far more than the loudest argument ever could. One of the biggest misconceptions about empaths is that they leave relationships impulsively. People often assume that if an empath suddenly becomes quiet, they've changed overnight or made an emotional decision in the heat of the moment. In reality, the silence you see is rarely the beginning of the ending. More often, it's the final chapter of a process that has been unfolding for a long time beneath the surface. By the time an empath stops talking, stops explaining, or stops trying to repair the connection, they've usually exhausted every emotional resource they were willing to give. An empath naturally pays close attention to the emotional atmosphere around them. They notice shifts in tone, subtle changes in behavior, hesitation in someone's voice, and even the emotions that people try to hide. Because they are highly observant of emotional patterns, they often recognize problems much earlier than others do. Instead of reacting immediately, they usually choose patience. They convince themselves that people have bad days, make mistakes, or simply need understanding. They continue giving chances because preserving the relationship feels more valuable than proving a point. This willingness to understand can become both a strength and a burden. Every ignored message, broken promise, dismissive comment, or repeated disappointment adds another layer of emotional weight. Most of these moments seem insignificant on their own, but together they create a pattern. An empath doesn't usually judge someone based on a single event. They judge the consistency of behavior over time. They ask themselves whether respect is increasing or disappearing, whether effort is mutual or one-sided, and whether emotional safety still exists within the relationship. Many people mistake this patience for unlimited tolerance. They believe that because the empath forgave yesterday, they will forgive tomorrow as well. This assumption creates a dangerous cycle. The other person becomes comfortable offering apologies instead of change, explanations instead of accountability, and temporary effort instead of lasting growth. Meanwhile, the empath quietly continues collecting evidence. Every repeated behavior confirms what words can no longer deny. What's important to understand is that an empath often communicates their concerns long before they become silent. They express how certain actions affect them, explain what they need, and attempt to solve problems through honest conversation. They don't expect perfection. They simply hope their vulnerability will be met with genuine effort. When those conversations repeatedly lead nowhere, something begins to change internally. The goal shifts from saving the relationship to protecting their own emotional well-being. This internal shift is almost invisible to the outside world. The empath may still smile, still respond politely, and still fulfill their responsibilities. On the surface, everything appears normal. Beneath that calm exterior, however, they're slowly letting go of expectations. They're accepting that the relationship they hoped for may never exist. Instead of arguing harder, they begin observing more. Instead of demanding change, they start measuring whether change happens naturally. Their emotional investment decreases not because they stop caring instantly, but because repeated disappointment gradually replaces hope with acceptance. Silence becomes significant because it represents the moment when words no longer seem useful. The empath has already explained their feelings enough times to know that repeating them will not produce a different outcome. They recognize that genuine change comes from personal choice, not constant reminders. Continuing to argue would only drain energy without creating understanding. Rather than chasing validation or forcing another conversation, they redirect that emotional energy inward, becoming quieter not out of anger, but because the decision has already been made within themselves. Long before an empath becomes noticeably quiet, an internal emotional process is already taking place. This process is rarely dramatic or visible. It doesn't happen because of one harsh conversation or one disappointing moment. Instead, it develops gradually as the empath begins comparing what people say with what they consistently do. They pay close attention to patterns rather than promises, and over time they start realizing that repeated behavior reveals far more about a person's intentions than occasional words ever can. At first, an empath often responds to emotional discomfort with curiosity instead of judgment. If someone becomes distant, they wonder whether that person is stressed. If someone reacts with irritation, they assume there may be unseen pressures influencing their behavior. This ability to see multiple perspectives makes empaths exceptionally compassionate, but it also causes them to delay recognizing unhealthy relationship dynamics. They spend considerable energy searching for explanations because they genuinely want to believe that people are capable of growth and change. As disappointments accumulate, something subtle begins to shift. The empath starts noticing that the same conversations keep happening without meaningful progress. Apologies become predictable, excuses become repetitive, and temporary improvements fade just as quickly as they appear. Instead of focusing on isolated incidents, the empath begins connecting them into a larger behavioral pattern. Human psychology naturally seeks consistency, and when someone's actions repeatedly contradict their promises, the empath slowly loses confidence in future change. One of the least understood aspects of this process is emotional recalibration. Rather than suddenly shutting down, the empath gradually adjusts their emotional investment to match reality instead of hope. They stop imagining who the other person could become and begin accepting who that person consistently chooses to be. This shift is often painful because it requires letting go of expectations that once motivated them to keep trying. The relationship becomes less about potential and more about observable behavior. During this period, the empath may actually appear calmer than before. They argue less, question less, and stop reacting to every disappointment. Someone unfamiliar with emotional psychology might mistake this as evidence that the relationship is improving. In truth, the opposite may be happening. The decrease in emotional intensity often reflects reduced emotional attachment. The empath is conserving energy because they no longer believe every conflict can be solved through communication alone. Another important change involves emotional boundaries. Empaths naturally absorb the emotions of those around them, often prioritizing another person's comfort over their own. As they become emotionally exhausted, they begin recognizing that constant self-sacrifice creates imbalance rather than connection. They start asking themselves difficult questions. Are their needs being respected? Is the relationship built on mutual effort? Are they carrying responsibilities that belong to someone else? These questions gradually replace the instinct to rescue or fix every problem. The empath also becomes more observant than expressive. Instead of explaining every hurt feeling, they quietly watch how people behave when no reminders are given. They notice whether kindness is offered freely or only after conflict. They observe whether respect exists when circumstances become difficult. They pay attention to consistency because consistency reflects character more accurately than emotional speeches or grand gestures. This silent observation provides clearer answers than repeated discussions ever could. As this emotional process continues, the empath experiences a growing sense of clarity. The confusion that once fueled endless conversations begins to disappear. They no longer need constant reassurance because they have gathered enough evidence through repeated experiences. Hope slowly gives way to acceptance, and acceptance changes the way they interact. Conversations become shorter, expectations become smaller, and emotional dependence steadily weakens. The silence that eventually follows is not created by emotional emptiness, but by emotional certainty, shaped through countless quiet moments of observation, reflection, and honest recognition of patterns that can no longer be ignored. One of the clearest indicators that an empath has emotionally checked out is that the relationship often began ending long before anyone noticed. From the outside, everything may appear relatively normal. The empath still shows up, still communicates politely, and still fulfills responsibilities. They don't announce every emotional shift because they aren't interested in creating unnecessary drama. Instead, their internal world begins changing in quiet, almost invisible ways. These subtle behavioral changes often go unnoticed until the distance becomes impossible to ignore. The first sign is a noticeable reduction in emotional investment. An empath who once eagerly asked about your day, remembered small details, and actively looked for ways to strengthen the connection gradually becomes less engaged. This isn't because they suddenly stopped caring. It's because they have learned that emotional effort without reciprocity eventually leads to exhaustion. Rather than continuing to pour energy into a relationship that no longer feels balanced, they begin protecting that energy for themselves. Another behavioral shift involves communication. Earlier in the relationship, an empath usually believes that honest conversations can solve almost any problem. They explain their feelings carefully, hoping mutual understanding will lead to healthier behavior. As repeated conversations fail to produce meaningful change, their communication becomes simpler and less emotionally detailed. They stop explaining every disappointment because experience has taught them that repeating the same concerns rarely changes established patterns. Their silence is not confusion. It reflects a growing belief that actions speak more clearly than discussions. Their expectations also begin to change. At one time, they may have looked forward to shared experiences, future plans, and emotional growth together. As disappointment accumulates, they quietly lower those expectations. They stop waiting for promises to become reality and begin adapting to the relationship exactly as it exists. This adjustment often happens without confrontation. Instead of asking for more attention, respect, or consistency, they simply stop expecting those things altogether. You may also notice that they become emotionally independent. An empath who once relied on the relationship for emotional connection starts finding fulfillment elsewhere. They invest more time in personal growth, friendships, family, hobbies, or professional goals. This isn't necessarily an attempt to punish anyone. It's a natural response to realizing that emotional security cannot depend on someone who consistently fails to provide it. Their focus gradually shifts from repairing the relationship to rebuilding themselves. Conflict begins to disappear as well. Many people mistakenly celebrate this change, believing fewer arguments mean greater harmony. In reality, reduced conflict sometimes signals reduced emotional attachment. People only argue intensely when they still believe their efforts might influence the outcome. Once an empath concludes that their concerns are unlikely to be heard or respected, they stop investing energy in repeated disagreements. The absence of arguments may actually indicate the absence of hope. Another subtle sign is the disappearance of emotional reassurance. The empath no longer seeks constant validation, clarification, or explanations. Questions that once mattered deeply no longer feel important because they've already reached their own conclusions. Instead of wondering why someone behaves a certain way, they begin accepting that behavior as part of the person's character. This acceptance removes the need for endless analysis and emotional negotiation. Perhaps the most overlooked behavioral change is their increasing sense of peace. While others expect heartbreak to look chaotic, an empath often becomes surprisingly calm during the final stage of emotional detachment. The anxiety that once fueled difficult conversations begins fading because internal conflict has been replaced by clarity. They no longer feel trapped between hope and disappointment. Their decisions become quieter, their emotions become steadier, and their attention naturally shifts toward environments where respect, consistency, and emotional safety no longer have to be requested. One of the most misunderstood reactions to an empath's silence comes from people who have grown accustomed to always having access to their attention, patience, and emotional availability. When that steady source of reassurance suddenly disappears, many toxic individuals become confused. They often assume the silence is temporary, another emotional phase, or an attempt to gain attention. What they fail to recognize is that an empath's silence is usually the result of careful observation and repeated disappointment rather than impulsive emotion. They mistake calmness for weakness because they have never seen what emotional certainty looks like. Toxic relationship dynamics often rely on predictability. A person who manipulates, dismisses, or controls others becomes familiar with certain emotional cycles. They expect confrontation, forgiveness, another chance, and eventually a return to normal. Over time, these repeated cycles create a false sense of security. The toxic individual begins believing that no matter what happens, the relationship will continue because the empath has always chosen understanding over separation. This belief makes them underestimate the quiet changes taking place beneath the surface. When the empath finally stops participating in these familiar patterns, the balance suddenly shifts. There are no lengthy explanations, emotional debates, or desperate attempts to fix what has already been broken. Instead, there is emotional distance. For someone who depended on predictable reactions, this unexpected calm creates uncertainty. Human behavior naturally seeks familiar patterns, and when those patterns disappear without warning, people often experience discomfort because they can no longer predict what comes next. Another reason toxic people misread an empath's silence is that they often confuse emotional expression with emotional attachment. They assume that arguments, tears, or repeated conversations prove someone still cares deeply. As long as the empath continues reacting emotionally, they believe the connection remains intact. What they overlook is that emotional intensity frequently reflects investment, not instability. Once the empath stops reacting altogether, it often signals that emotional investment has already been withdrawn. The silence is not empty, it reflects a decision that no longer requires constant discussion. Many toxic individuals also rely on the belief that apologies alone can repair damaged trust. They assume that the right words, a temporary display of affection, or short-lived behavioral changes will restore the relationship. This strategy may have worked before because the empath genuinely wanted to believe in growth and second chances. However, after repeated experiences, the empath begins evaluating consistency instead of promises. They become less interested in impressive apologies and more interested in sustainable actions. Without realizing it, the toxic person continues offering the same solutions to problems that now require entirely different responses. Another common misunderstanding involves control. Some toxic people believe silence is a negotiation tactic designed to pressure them into changing. They expect the empath to eventually return once enough time has passed. This expectation comes from projecting their own communication style onto someone else. They assume everyone uses silence as a strategic tool because that is how they understand influence. They fail to recognize that an empath's silence often has a completely different purpose. It is not intended to manipulate another person. It is intended to protect emotional well-being by stepping away from patterns that have repeatedly caused harm. As the silence continues, confusion often turns into frustration because familiar methods of influence stop producing familiar results. Attempts to provoke emotional reactions receive little response. Efforts to restart old cycles feel ineffective because the empath is no longer participating in the emotional framework that once sustained the relationship. The toxic individual begins realizing that access to the empath's attention, patience, and emotional energy was never guaranteed. What once seemed permanent was actually maintained through the empath's willingness to keep believing that change was possible. And once that belief quietly disappears, the relationship no longer operates according to the expectations that previously gave the toxic person a sense of certainty. When an empath reaches the point of moving on, the most significant transformation is not what happens in the relationship, but what happens within their own mind. Many people imagine moving on as an emotional battle filled with dramatic confrontations or visible anger. In reality, an empath's final stage of detachment is often remarkably quiet. They stop trying to convince others to understand their feelings because they recognize that genuine understanding cannot be forced. This realization changes the way they approach both relationships and their own emotional well-being. One of the first psychological changes is the release of unrealistic expectations. Earlier, the empath may have believed that enough patience, communication, or compassion could eventually transform the relationship. They invested energy because they saw potential rather than reality. Over time, experience teaches them an important lesson. People change when they personally choose to change, not because someone else loves them enough. Accepting this truth allows the empath to stop carrying responsibility for another person's decisions. As emotional attachment fades, the empath begins reclaiming mental space that was once occupied by constant analysis. Instead of replaying conversations, questioning every interaction, or searching for hidden meanings, their attention gradually shifts toward their own goals and personal growth. This creates a noticeable sense of emotional relief. The mind no longer feels trapped in endless cycles of hope and disappointment. Energy that was once spent managing relationship stress becomes available for healthier pursuits. Another important aspect of moving on is the restoration of emotional boundaries. Throughout difficult relationships, empaths often place another person's needs ahead of their own. They become accustomed to solving problems, providing reassurance, and maintaining emotional stability for everyone around them. Once they decide to move forward, they begin recognizing that healthy relationships require mutual effort rather than constant self-sacrifice. They become more selective about where they invest their time, attention, and emotional energy. This new perspective also changes how they evaluate future relationships. Instead of being impressed by charm, promises, or intense emotional moments, they begin looking for consistency. They pay attention to whether actions align with words, whether respect remains present during disagreements, and whether accountability exists without constant reminders. Past experiences sharpen their ability to recognize behavioral patterns earlier, allowing them to make decisions based on observable reality instead of hopeful assumptions. An empath who has truly moved on also becomes more comfortable with solitude. This doesn't mean they reject connection or stop valuing relationships. Rather, they discover that peace is more valuable than remaining in an environment that repeatedly damages their emotional health. Being alone no longer feels like a loss. It becomes an opportunity to rebuild confidence, strengthen self-awareness, and reconnect with interests that may have been neglected while trying to preserve an unhealthy relationship. One of the most noticeable differences is their emotional consistency. They are no longer pulled into every conflict or distracted by every attempt to recreate old dynamics. Situations that once triggered anxiety or self-doubt begin losing their emotional power. This calmness isn't the result of emotional numbness. It comes from a clearer aim of personal values, healthier boundaries, and a stronger commitment to protecting inner peace. As this transformation continues, the empath becomes increasingly focused on relationships that offer genuine reciprocity. They invest where trust is earned, where communication flows naturally, and where emotional support moves in both directions. Instead of chasing validation from people who repeatedly withheld it, they surround themselves with individuals who demonstrate reliability through consistent behavior. Their quiet confidence reflects an important psychological shift. They no longer measure their worth by another person's willingness to appreciate them. And because of that, they stop looking back at relationships that required them to abandon their own emotional needs just to keep someone else comfortable.